On June 22nd of 1941, Adolf Hitler unleashed Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. More than 3 million German troops, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashed across the Soviet border along a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The German advance was devastating and rapid, pushing deep into Soviet territory. Within weeks, German forces inflicted heavy losses on the Red Army. To many observers, it appeared that the Axis powers would quickly achieve another victory. The survival of the Soviet Union hung by a thread. If the USSR fell, Nazi Germany would control the resources of an entire continent, and Britain would stand alone once more. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill understood the stakes immediately. Despite his lifelong opposition to communism and the Soviet system, Churchill recognized that Britain's survival now depended on keeping the Soviet Union in the war. Putting aside his antipathy to Bolshevism, Churchill authorized urgent naval convoys of vital war material to Russia. On the evening of that fateful June day, Churchill addressed the British people, declaring his intention to provide the Soviet Union with whatever help Britain could muster. The question was how to deliver that help. With German forces occupying most of continental Europe, the most direct route to reach Soviet ports was by sea, through the Arctic Ocean. This route would take Allied merchant ships past German-occupied Norway, through some of the most treacherous waters on Earth, into the teeth of German air, submarine and surface forces. It would become one of the most dangerous supply routes of the entire war, and the men who sailed it would face conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. This is the story of the Arctic Convoys, a crucial factor in Allied victory in the Second World War, yet one that remained overlooked for decades. The German invasion of the Soviet Union transformed the strategic landscape of the Second World War overnight. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill realized that the British would no longer face the enemy might alone. On July 12, 1941, Britain and the Soviet Union signed a mutual assistance agreement, pledging to render each other support of all kinds in the war against Nazi Germany. Before September 1941, the British had already dispatched 450 aircraft, 22,000 long tons of rubber, 3 million pairs of boots and stocks of tin, aluminum, jute, lead, and wool. In September, British and American representatives travelled to Moscow to assess Soviet requirements and their capacity to receive supplies. The three nations drew up formal protocols to govern the flow of aid. The American Lend-Lease program, which Congress had passed on March 11, 1941, was extended to include the Soviet Union. Through Lend-Lease and the Anglo-Soviet Agreement, the Western Allies would eventually send massive quantities of equipment, raw materials and supplies to help sustain the Soviet war effort. The strategic importance of this aid cannot be overstated. By the end of 1941, 187 Matilda II and 249 Valentine tanks had been delivered, comprising 25% of the medium-heavy tanks in the Red Army, making 30 to 40% of the medium-heavy tanks defending Moscow. In December 1941, 16% of the fighters defending Moscow were Hawker Hurricanes and Curtiss Tomahawks from Britain. The 17,000 long tons of aluminum sent from Britain was equivalent to the capacity lost in the Soviet Union in the 6 months from October 1941. 3 routes existed to transport supplies to the Soviet Union: through the Persian Gulf and Iran, across the Pacific to Soviet Far Eastern ports, and through the Arctic. The shortest route was to Russia's northern ports of Murmansk and Arkhangelsk, sailing through Arctic waters above Nazi-occupied Norway from Iceland. This Arctic route was the most direct but also the most perilous. The Arctic Convoy route was a geographical nightmare. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, the most direct route was by sea, around northern Norway to the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. Ships would assemble at Hvalfjörður in Iceland, then sail northeast past Bear Island, threading through the narrow corridor between the Arctic ice pack to the north and German-occupied Norway to the south. The most dangerous part of the journey funneled the ships between Arctic pack ice and the dangerous Norwegian coast. The route passed through a narrow funnel between the Arctic ice pack and German bases in Norway and was very dangerous, especially in winter when the ice came further south. In winter months, when the ice edge advanced southward, the navigable channel narrowed even further, forcing convoys to sail closer to the enemy-held coastline. Murmansk, located on the Kola inlet of the Barents Sea, had the advantage of remaining ice-free year-round due to the warming influence of the Gulf Stream. Arkhangelsk, on the White Sea, froze solid during winter months, making it inaccessible for much of the year. Both ports became primary destinations for the convoys, with supplies then transported south by rail, barge, or truck to where they were needed most desperately. The natural environment itself was an enemy. Sailing through the northern waters was not an easy task, as the waters of the Barents Sea as well as the neighbouring Norwegian Sea and Kara Sea were known for unpredictable storms. The weather conditions were atrocious. Enormous, violent waves bombarded the ships. The gales were fierce and it was bitterly cold. The cold temperature posed constant danger. Spray freezing instantly on ships' superstructures created mountains of ice that could capsize vessels, if not constantly chipped away. Men working on deck faced the risk of frostbite within minutes. If a ship was sunk, survival time in the frigid water was measured in seconds, not minutes. The Arctic sea temperature would kill a man faster than he could drown. During summer months, a different challenge emerged: perpetual daylight. In clear weather, nothing obscured the view from searching German planes. The midnight sun meant no darkness to hide in, no cover from prowling aircraft and submarines. Winter brought the opposite problem. Months of polar night made navigation treacherous, and signalling between ships nearly impossible, though at least darkness offered concealment from air attacks. But the greatest dangers were man-made. The route took the ships very close to the northern coast of Norway, which was occupied by the Germans and patrolled by aircraft, surface vessels and U-boats. German air bases in northern Norway could launch strikes against the convoys throughout much of their journey. U-boats operated from Norwegian ports, hunting in wolf packs, and most ominously, powerful German surface warships, including the battleship Tirpitz, heavy cruisers and destroyers, lurked in Norwegian fjords, ready to sortie against the convoys. The loss rate for Allied ships was higher than on any other Allied convoy series. The Arctic Run would earn a grim nickname among those who sailed it: the Murmansk Run. The first Anglo-Soviet link-up of naval forces took place on July 31st, 1941, when Soviet destroyer Sokrushitelny made rendezvous with British minelayer HMS Adventure near the Gorodetsky Lighthouse at the entrance to the White Sea in northern Russia. On August 18, 1941, the first of the Arctic Convoys, codenamed Operation Dervish, set sail from Liverpool. 7 merchantmen with an escort of 14 Royal Navy ships arrived in Arkhangelsk 13 days later. This first voyage escaped Berlin's notice. It was an encouraging beginning, but subsequent convoys would face far greater challenges. Starting in September 1941, the convoys were codenamed in numerical sequence, with the prefix PQ denoting supply-laden convoys sailing from Iceland, and QP denoting returning convoys. The first convoy sailed in September 1941. From Convoy Dervish to Convoy PQ-11, the supplies to the USSR were mostly from Britain, in British ships defended by the Royal Navy. The first convoy left Britain in August 1941, and by the spring of 1942, only one ship of the 103 that had been sent had been lost, and 12 convoys had passed through those waters. This early success was deceptive. The Germans were still organising their northern forces, and winter darkness had provided cover for many of the convoys. As 1942 progressed, the situation would change dramatically. The early convoys established the pattern that would persist throughout the war. Ships would gather at Loch Ewe on Scotland's northwest coast, or at Hvalfjörður in Iceland. They would be organised into columns, typically sailing at the speed of the slowest vessel, often no more than 8 or 9 knots. A close escort of destroyers, corvettes, minesweepers and armed trawlers would surround the merchant ships, providing anti-submarine protection and air defence. Beyond this close escort, a covering force of cruisers would sail within supporting distance, ready to intercept German surface raiders. Further still, a distant covering force built around battleships would patrol, deterring any sortie by Germany's heavy warships. For 18 months, HMS Belfast and her crew endured punishing conditions, supporting the vital Arctic convoys delivering supplies to the Soviet Union. The rough seas rocked the escort carriers so badly it made them extremely challenging landing platforms. When escort carriers were in short supply, catapult aircraft merchant ships, CAM ships, were used instead. When enemy aircraft engaged the convoy, a rocket-propelled catapult would launch a single Hawker Hurricane into the air to engage the threat. It could not return to the ship, however, so the pilot would have to bail out near the convoy and await rescue. This desperate measure illustrated the lengths to which the Royal Navy went to protect these vital convoys. By 1942, the Germans had fully recognised the strategic importance of the Arctic convoys and moved to stop them. The Germans laid plans to stop the Arctic convoys in 1942. They reinforced their northern Norway bases with additional U-boats, aircraft and surface warships. The first military loss from these convoys happened to PQ-8 when U-454 sank the British destroyer HMS Matabele with almost all hands northeast of the Kola Peninsula on January 17, 1942. This marked the beginning of intensified German operations against the convoys. Luftwaffe bomber and torpedo squadrons deployed to northern airfields began mounting sustained attacks on passing convoys. U-boat wolf packs were stationed along the convoy routes. Most ominously, the German battleship Tirpitz, sister ship to the legendary Bismarck, arrived in Norwegian waters in January 1942, accompanied by the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, heavy cruisers, and destroyer flotillas. From May 24th right until May 30th, 1942, German aircraft made 245 bomber and torpedo sorties against convoy PQ-16, the largest Russia convoy so far with 30 ships, sinking 5 ships and damaging 4. This was the biggest blow any convoy had suffered in the Arctic, but worse was yet to come. The reinforcement of the German fleet in Norway with the arrival of the Scharnhorst forced the British to suspend the Arctic convoys during the summer of 1943. The mere presence of these powerful warships in Norwegian fjords forced the Royal Navy to maintain heavy covering forces for every convoy, straining resources needed elsewhere in the global war. The Germans developed sophisticated tactics for attacking the convoys. U-boats would shadow and report convoy positions, guiding in airstrikes. Aircraft would attack in waves, focusing on merchant ships while trying to overwhelm the escort's anti-aircraft defences. Surface raiders would wait for opportunities when convoys were beyond the range of heavy British covering forces. This multi-layered threat system created a gauntlet that grew more deadly with each passing month. The longer summer days of 1942 would provide the perfect opportunity for the Germans to demonstrate just how vulnerable the Arctic convoys had become. When convoy PQ-17, along with Nagats and the Pan-Atlantic, sailed from Iceland on June 27, 1942, headed for the Soviet port of Arkhangelsk, they faced stiffening German air and naval defences, brutal Arctic temperatures, and around-the-clock daylight which meant no protection from the cover of darkness. On June 27, 1942, convoy PQ-17 departed Iceland for the Soviet Union. 35 merchantmen, a third of them American, escorted by more than a dozen British corvettes, destroyers and other warships, had departed from Iceland. This was the largest and most valuable convoy yet, to make the Murmansk Run, carrying more than $500 million of military equipment to the beleaguered Soviet Union. Initially, PQ-17 had a strong escort and covering force, including the battleship USS Washington, to protect the 35-ship convoy from attack. The convoy steamed northeast in multiple columns, its escorts maintaining anti-submarine screens around the perimeter. For the first few days, despite German reconnaissance aircraft shadowing them, the convoy made good progress. At first, things seemed to be going well for the convoy, as they beat off multiple German air attacks with relative ease. The convoy was located by German forces on July 1st, shadowed and attacked. Luftwaffe bombers struck at the convoy but were driven off by concentrated anti-aircraft fire and defensive maneuvering. The close escort was performing admirably. Then came the catastrophic order that would seal the convoy's fate. In London, at the Admiralty, intelligence reports indicated that the German battleship Tirpitz, accompanied by heavy cruisers and destroyers, had left its anchorage in Alton Fjord. The Admiralty feared the German surface fleet was about to fall upon PQ-17 like a hammer. Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, the First Sea Lord, faced a terrible decision. Fearing an imminent attack from German surface ships like Tirpitz, the escort ships fled west while the merchant ships made for the Soviet Union. At specific times, on July 4, 1942, the Admiralty sent messages to the convoy commanders ordering the cruiser force to withdraw westward at high speed, then ordering the convoy to disperse, and finally sending the fateful message, "Convoy is to scatter. Convoy is to scatter." These words sent chills down the spines of the men sailing in these merchant ships. The order to scatter was reserved for the most extreme emergencies, when surface attack was imminent and inevitable. Every ship's captain knew what it meant. The convoy disintegrated. Merchant ships turned in all directions, each making independently for Soviet ports hundreds of miles away. The close escort withdrew westward to engage the anticipated German fleet. The cruiser covering force pulled back at high speed. The merchant ships were left naked and alone in enemy waters. But the Tirpitz was nowhere near the convoy. In fact, it was still at its moorings in northern Norway. The intelligence had been incomplete or misinterpreted. The German surface fleet sortie had been aborted before it ever posed a real threat. Instead of saving the convoy from disaster, Admiral Pound's order had doomed PQ-17 to destruction. German aircraft and U-boats fell upon the scattered merchantmen like wolves among sheep. Over the following week, 2/3 of the convoy were sunk by German aircraft and U-boats. Out of 34 merchant ships, only 11 would make it to port. Isolated ships were hunted down one by one, hit by torpedoes or bombs, their crews forced to abandon ship into lifeboats surrounded by ice floes. One creative commanding officer, Lieutenant Leo Gradwell of HMS Ayrshire, led his small group of ships north into the Arctic ice pack. They camouflaged their vessels with white paint and sheets, arranged tanks on deck into defensive positions, and waited until German reconnaissance aircraft passed overhead without detecting them. This group eventually reached safety, but they were the exception. 153 merchant seamen lost their lives. Of those, only 7 had perished before the convoy was scattered. The loss of material was extremely heavy. 22 merchant ships had been lost, with a total of 142,518 tons of shipping, and with them 3,350 motor vehicles, 430 tanks, 210 bombers, and 99,316 tons of general cargo, including radar sets and ammunition. Winston Churchill described convoy PQ-17 as one of the most melancholy naval episodes in the whole of the war. It was the biggest loss to a British convoy of the Second World War. The disaster led to the temporary suspension of Arctic convoys and created lasting tensions between British and American naval commands. It also demonstrated that German forces, properly coordinated, could inflict devastating losses on the convoys. The PQ-17 disaster forced a fundamental reassessment of convoy operations. Future convoys would sail only during the darkest winter months when perpetual night provided cover. Escort forces would be strengthened. Most importantly, no convoy would be ordered to scatter again unless actually under surface attack. The lessons learned at such terrible cost would influence the remainder of the Arctic convoy campaign. After the PQ-17 catastrophe, Arctic convoy operations were suspended for months. Convoy operations to Russia were suspended after PQ-18 disaster and not resumed until JW-51 sailed in December 1942. When they resumed in late 1942, the designation changed from PQ/QP to JW outbound and RA homebound. Convoy JW-51B departed Loch U on December 22, 1942, and met its escort off Iceland on December 25. The convoy comprised 14 merchant ships carrying war materials to the USSR, some 202 tanks, 2,046 vehicles, 87 fighters, 33 bombers, 10,268 tons of fuel, 11,296 tons of aviation fuel, and slightly more than 48,214 tons of other supplies. The convoy was protected by a close escort of destroyers, corvettes, the minesweeper HMS Bramble, and armed trawlers. Force R, under Rear Admiral Robert Burnett, with the cruisers HMS Sheffield and Jamaica and 2 destroyers, was independently stationed in the Barents Sea to provide distant cover. On December 27th, the convoy ran into a gale which scattered the convoy over the next 2 days into several groups across a wide area. Several ships and escorts became separated in the storm. HMS Bramble was detached to search for stragglers. When the weather moderated, the convoy regrouped and continued eastward. U-354 sighted JW-51B on December 30th south of Bear Island. The U-boat's report reached German headquarters, and Admiral Oskar Kummitz was ordered to sea immediately. On December 31st, a German force under the command of Vice Admiral Oskar Kummitz began Operation Regenbogen, Operation Rainbow. The force comprised the heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper and Lützow and 6 destroyers. Kummitz divided his force into 2 groups. Admiral Hipper would attack from the north, driving the convoy south into the path of Lützow, approaching from that direction. The convoy would be caught in a pincer between 2 powerful German heavy cruisers, each armed with 8-inch guns and capable of obliterating the lightly armed merchant ships. At 8 o'clock on December 31st, the main body of convoy JW-51B, 12 ships and 8 warships, were some 120 miles north of the coast of Finnmark, heading east. The encounter would take place in the perpetual darkness of the Arctic winter, with both forces scattered and uncertain of positions. The entire battle would become a confused affair fought in snow squalls and near total darkness. At 8:20 a.m., the British destroyer Obdurate spotted 3 German destroyers behind the convoy. Then Onslow saw Admiral Hipper, also behind the convoy. Captain Robert Sherbrooke, commanding the destroyer escort from HMS Onslow, immediately grasped the danger and moved to place his destroyers between the German heavy cruisers and the convoy. Onslow, along with Orwell, Obedient and Obdurate, steered to intercept the German ships. Achates was ordered to stay with the convoy and make a lot of smoke to hide the merchant ships. Captain Sherbrooke knew his torpedoes were his strongest weapons, even though he was outgunned. The British destroyers began making aggressive torpedo runs toward Admiral Hipper, forcing the German cruiser to maneuver defensively. Admiral Kummitz had been given strict orders not to risk his valuable ships. The memory of the Bismarck's fate haunted German naval command. Each time the British destroyers threatened a torpedo attack, Hipper pulled back, unwilling to risk damage. This caution would prove costly. Admiral Hipper soon returned for a second attack. It hit Onslow, causing heavy damage and many casualties, including 17 sailors killed. Captain Robert Sherbrooke was badly wounded and lost the sight in his left eye. Command passed to HMS Obedient as Onslow limped away, heavily damaged but still afloat. Admiral Hipper then moved north of the convoy and unexpectedly found Bramble, the British minesweeper. The little minesweeper searching for stragglers had no chance against the heavy cruiser's 8-inch guns. Bramble was blown apart with all hands. HMS Achates, laying smoke to screen the merchant ships, was also hit and badly damaged. She would eventually sink, but not before her crew had bought precious time for the convoy. Throughout this confused engagement, Lützow was maneuvering to the south of the convoy, perfectly positioned to devastate the merchant ships. But communication problems, poor visibility, and excessive caution prevented the German pocket battleship from ever opening fire. The opportunity passed unused. Then Rear Admiral Burnett's cruiser force arrived at the critical moment. HMS Sheffield and Jamaica suddenly appeared on the scene. 24 6-inch shells were fired at the hipper. 1 from the Sheffield and 2 from the Jamaica hit the hipper. Taken by surprise, the German heavy cruiser turned away under cover of smoke from her escorting destroyers. One German destroyer, Friedrich Eckholt, became separated in the confusion and approached what her captain thought were friendly ships in the snow squalls. They were Sheffield and Jamaica. At point-blank range, the British cruisers opened fire. Friedrich Eckholt was obliterated, sinking with all hands. Admiral Kummetz, now aware that British cruisers had arrived and fearing additional heavy forces might be present, ordered a withdrawal. The German surface force returned to Norway without having accomplished its mission. The 15 ships of Convoy JW-51B arrived at Murmansk without loss, though one had been damaged. The British lost the minesweeper Bramble and the destroyer Akates, while the Germans lost the destroyer Friedrich Eckholt. Captain Robert Sherbrooke was awarded the Victoria Cross. He acknowledged that it had really been awarded in honour of the whole crew of Onslow. His aggressive leadership and willingness to accept damage to his ship in order to protect the convoy had been decisive. But the battle's most significant consequences were political. The German raiders' failure to inflict significant losses on the convoy infuriated Hitler, who ordered that German naval strategy would henceforth concentrate on the U-boat fleet rather than surface ships. Adolf Hitler was infuriated at what he regarded as the uselessness of the surface raiders, seeing that 2 heavy cruisers were driven off by mere destroyers. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, offered his resignation, which Hitler accepted. Raeder was replaced by Admiral Karl Dönitz, who saved the German surface fleet from being scrapped, though many ships were laid up. The Battle of the Barents Sea had not only saved a convoy, it had effectively neutralized the threat of German surface raiders in the Arctic. Despite the outcome at the Barents Sea, one powerful German warship remained a potent threat: the battleship Scharnhorst. Scharnhorst, a key concern for the convoys, was one of Nazi Germany's last great battleships and one of the best-known fighting ships of the Second World War. Along with her sister ship Gneisenau, Scharnhorst had been a thorn in the Royal Navy's side throughout the war. In early 1943, Scharnhorst joined the battleship Tirpitz in Norway to interdict Allied convoys to the Soviet Union. By late 1943, with Tirpitz badly damaged by British midget submarines and Germany's situation on the Eastern Front deteriorating rapidly, pressure mounted to use Scharnhorst against the convoys. With the rapidly deteriorating military situation for the German army on the Eastern Front, it became increasingly important to interrupt the flow of supplies from the Western Allies to the Soviet Union. On December 19, 1943, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz attended a conference at Hitler's headquarters and made a clear commitment that Scharnhorst and destroyers would attack the next Allied convoy. Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, wished to neutralize Scharnhorst and planned a confrontation over Christmas 1943, in which convoy JW-55B would be used to draw out the enemy. Fraser was setting a trap, using the convoy as bait to lure Scharnhorst into battle. Convoy JW-55B had left Loch Ewe on December 20th and was sighted 2 days later by a Luftwaffe aircraft which commenced shadowing. On December 20th, 1943, Convoy JW-55B, comprising 19 merchant ships screened by 10 destroyers, sailed for Russia to resupply the Eastern Front. On December 25th, Scharnhorst under Captain Fritz Hintzer, with 5 destroyers, left Norway's Altenfjord under the overall command of Rear Admiral Erik Bay. The German force sailed into deteriorating weather, a southwesterly gale that would hamper operations. Fraser had carefully positioned his forces. Vice Admiral Robert Burnett was at Murmansk on board HMS Belfast, having escorted a previous convoy. Intelligence from intercepted German naval signals revealed that Scharnhorst and 5 destroyers had left their Norwegian base. Burnett's cruiser force, HMS Belfast, HMS Norfolk, and HMS Sheffield, moved to intercept. Fraser put to sea with Force 2 consisting of his flagship, the battleship HMS Duke of York, the cruiser HMS Jamaica, and 4 destroyers including the Norwegian HNOMS Stord. Fraser positioned his battleship to intercept Scharnhorst between the convoy and the German base, cutting off the enemy's line of retreat. The battle unfolded on December 26, 1943, Boxing Day. The stormy weather had resulted in the grounding of all Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes, leaving Rear Admiral Bay unable to locate the convoy. In heavy seas, Bay detached his destroyers to expand the search area. The destroyers subsequently lost contact with Scharnhorst and would play no further part in the battle. At 7:03, Scharnhorst was some 40 nautical miles southwest of Bear Island when she made a turn that would put her in position to attack the convoy at 10 o'clock. But Burnet's cruisers were waiting. Burnet, commanding Norfolk, Belfast and Sheffield, placed his ships between the convoy and Scharnhorst's expected direction of attack. HMS Belfast used radar to detect the Scharnhorst and fired star shells to illuminate the battleship. At 09:29, the cruisers opened fire on Scharnhorst at ranges between 4 and 8 miles. Surprised by the sudden appearance of British cruisers, Scharnhorst returned fire and then turned south at high speed, outrunning her pursuers in the heavy seas. But Belfast maintained radar contact, tracking the German battleship through the Arctic night. Vice Admiral Burnet assumed that Scharnhorst wanted to try again to attack the convoy from the north, and decided to close into the convoy by the shortest route. His judgment proved correct. Around noon, Scharnhorst turned north for another attempt at the convoy. The cruisers intercepted her again. This second action lasted about 20 minutes. Norfolk received a direct hit that knocked out her after turret, killed an officer and 5 men, and destroyed most of her radar. But once again, Scharnhorst broke off and turned south at high speed, this time heading toward home. Unknowingly, Scharnhorst was steaming directly toward Admiral Fraser's battleship force. At 16:20 on December 26th, the major British force led by Duke of York made radar contact with Scharnhorst at 20 miles. Fraser closed the range, positioning Duke of York perfectly. At 12,000 yards in the Arctic night, Fraser illuminated Scharnhorst with star shell and opened fire using fire control radar. Duke of York's 14-inch guns roared, their shells straddling the German battleship. Scharnhorst returned fire, but Duke of York's superior fire control and heavier guns gave the British battleship the advantage. The Duke of York's guns inflicted heavy damage to the Scharnhorst, including disabling one of her boiler rooms, which reduced her speed considerably. Slowing under the pounding from Duke of York's guns, Scharnhorst became vulnerable to attacks by British destroyers. British destroyers darted in and out of effective firing range of the Scharnhorst, launching torpedoes and harrying the already damaged battleship. They managed to land multiple torpedo strikes on the Scharnhorst, crippling its propulsion and reducing its ability to defend itself effectively. The Norwegian destroyer Stord pressed home particularly aggressive attacks. For over an hour, the one-sided battle continued. Duke of York's heavy shells smashed into Scharnhorst's superstructure. Destroyer torpedoes tore open her hull below the waterline. The German battleship fought back desperately, her crew displaying remarkable courage, but the outcome was inevitable. Finally, dead in the water and aflame, Scharnhorst capsized and sank. Only 36 men survived, out of a crew of 1,968. The British destroyers rescued survivors from the freezing water, but most of Scharnhorst's crew went down with their ship. The Battle of the North Cape was the last between British and German big-gun capital ships. It was also the penultimate engagement between battleships in history, the last being the Battle of Surigao Strait in October 1944. With Scharnhorst sunk and Tirpitz permanently disabled, the surface threat to Arctic convoys was effectively eliminated. Convoy JW-55B reached Soviet ports safely, its mission accomplished. The trap Fraser had set had worked perfectly. The result increased the British advantage in major surface units and secured the Arctic convoy route for the remainder of the war. With the German surface threat neutralized, Arctic convoy operations continued with greater security through 1944 and into 1945. The threat from U-boats and aircraft remained, but the Royal Navy had developed improved tactics and technology to counter them. Convoys ran from August 1941 to May 1945, sailing via the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans, with periods of no sailings during several months in 1942 and in the summers of 1943 and 1944. The gaps in operations during summer months reflected the vulnerability created by 24-hour daylight, making it easier for German forces to locate and attack the convoys. There were 78 convoys between August 1941 and May 1945. The convoys were codenamed in numerical sequence, with the prefix PQ for outbound and QP for homebound convoys, later changing to JW and RA from 1943. About 1,400 merchant ships delivered supplies to the Soviet Union under the Anglo-Soviet Agreement and US Lend-Lease program, mainly escorted by ships of the Royal Navy, with support from the Royal Canadian Navy and the US Navy. Over 4 million tons of supplies were delivered to the Russians. As well as tanks and aircraft, these included less sensational but still vital items like trucks, tractors, telephone wire, railway engines and boots. The supplies sustained the Red Army through its most critical battles and contributed significantly to the Soviet victory on the Eastern Front. The final Arctic Convoy, JW-67, set sail on May 12, 1945, 4 days after the signing of the surrender of German forces in Europe to the Allies. Its escorts returned to Britain with 5 surrendered U-boats in tow. The war in Europe was over, and with it, the need for the Arctic convoys. The price paid for maintaining this vital lifeline was staggering. At the end of the war, 104 merchant vessels were lost. The Royal Navy lost 24 warships, and overall 3,500 Allied servicemen lost their lives. 85 merchant vessels and 16 British warships, 2 cruisers, 6 destroyers, 8 other escort ships were lost. The Kriegsmarine lost a number of vessels, including the battleship Scharnhorst, 3 destroyers, and 30 U-boats, and the Luftwaffe suffered the loss of many aircraft. It was also very perilous for the pilots trying to defend the convoys. It was equally dangerous for the Germans trying to prevent the convoys from reaching Russia. The human stories behind these statistics reveal extraordinary courage and endurance. Men served in conditions that defied imagination, temperatures far below zero, violent storms that could last for days, constant threat of attack, perpetual darkness in winter, or blinding daylight in summer. Ice accumulated on ships faster than crews could chip it away. Exhaustion was constant. Fear was a permanent companion. Merchant seamen sailed knowing that if their ship was torpedoed, survival time in Arctic waters was measured in minutes at best. Naval crews remained at action stations for days at a time, manning guns in exposed positions where frostbite could strike within minutes. Officers navigated in conditions where a single error could mean running aground or colliding with another ship in the darkness or fog. The courage displayed was not the dramatic heroism of a single moment, but the quiet, sustained bravery of simply continuing to do one's duty in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Every convoy that reached Soviet ports represented not just a strategic success, but a triumph of human endurance over the most hostile environment imaginable. Over 3,000 Allied servicemen lost their lives on the convoys, with 85 merchant ships being sunk and 16 Royal Navy ships also succumbing to enemy attacks. Each loss represented individual tragedies, men who would never return home, families left grieving, futures never realized. The Arctic convoys were a crucial factor in Allied victory in the Second World War, yet surprisingly they're often overlooked when considering the decisive campaigns of the conflict. There have been no films made, and very few books written, about the brave men who sailed on the convoys bound for Russia. This lack of acknowledgement and appreciation for those who saw action rankled with the convoy veterans for many decades. After the war, as the Cold War froze relations between the West and the Soviet Union, the Arctic convoys became an awkward memory, a time when Britain and America had fought to keep communist Russia in the war. Recognition for the veterans came slowly and reluctantly. Although the supplies were valuable, the most important contribution made by the Arctic convoys was political. They proved that the Allies were committed to helping the Soviet Union, whilst deflecting Stalin's demands for a second front until they were ready. The convoys also tied up a large part of Germany's dwindling naval and air forces. The Russian convoys accounted for 20% of all the equipment and supplies used by the Soviets on the Eastern Front during the war. This material aid, arriving at critical moments in the war, helped ensure that the Red Army could continue fighting during the darkest days of 1941 to 1942, and provided the equipment needed for the great offensives of 1943 to 1945. The strategic importance of the convoys extended beyond the physical supplies delivered. They demonstrated to Stalin that Britain and America were serious about supporting the Soviet war effort, even when opening a second front in Western Europe remained impossible. They forced Germany to maintain substantial forces in Norway and the Arctic that might otherwise have been deployed on the Eastern Front or in the Mediterranean. They tied down German U-boats, aircraft and surface warships that might have concentrated against Atlantic convoys or threatened other Allied operations. In recent years, recognition has finally come to the Arctic Convoy veterans. In 2014, Russia's prestigious Ushakov Medal was awarded in London to 19 British servicemen who risked their lives to keep their wartime ally Russia supplied. Britain later instituted the Arctic Star Medal for those who served on the convoys, though for many veterans, this recognition came decades too late. For both Russia and Britain, the Arctic convoys are an enduring symbol of heroic cooperation in the joint fight to defeat Nazi Germany. The Arctic convoys, like the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, involved relatively few servicemen. But like that struggle, the debt owed by so many to those few thousand men who served on the convoys is immense. The Arctic convoys represent one of the most remarkable sustained military operations of the Second World War. For 4 years, through the darkest days of the conflict and into the light of approaching victory, Allied sailors and merchant seamen made the perilous journey to Soviet ports, carrying the supplies that would help turn the tide against Nazi Germany. They sailed through waters that nature itself seemed to have designated as impassable. They endured cold that could kill in minutes, storms that could sink the stoutest ships, and ice that could crush steel hulls like paper. They faced an enemy determined to stop them at any cost, equipped with submarines, aircraft, and powerful warships positioned to intercept their route. The statistics tell part of the story. 78 convoys, 1,400 merchant ships, 4 million tons of cargo, over 3,000 lives lost. But statistics cannot capture the human experience. The fear and courage, the exhaustion and determination, the losses and the narrow escapes, the friendships forged in adversity, and the memories that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The Arctic convoys demonstrated that in total war, victory depends not just on armies fighting battles, but on the unglamorous, dangerous work of keeping those armies supplied. The sailors who ran the Gauntlet to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk were not on the front lines, but their contribution to Allied victory was no less vital than those who fought at Stalingrad or Normandy. Their story is one of ordinary men, British, American, Canadian, Norwegian and others, asked to perform extraordinary tasks in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. They did not seek glory or recognition. They simply did their duty, convoy after convoy, through ice and fire, until the job was done. The Soviet Union survived the German onslaught, thanks in part to the supplies delivered by the Arctic convoys. The Red Army pushed the Wehrmacht back from Moscow, broke the siege of Leningrad, triumphed at Stalingrad, and eventually drove all the way to Berlin. The Eastern Front consumed 3/4 of Germany's military strength, making victory in the West possible, and that Eastern Front war effort was sustained, in critical measure, by ships that braved Arctic waters to reach Soviet ports. The Arctic convoys remind us that great victories in war are built on a foundation of countless acts of courage and sacrifice, many of them performed far from the spotlight of public attention. The men who sailed to Russia through the Arctic did not win the war alone, but without them, the war might well have been lost. Their legacy deserves to be remembered and honoured, not just as a remarkable military operation, but as a testament to human courage, endurance, and the willingness to face any danger in defence of freedom. In the frozen waters of the Arctic Ocean, surrounded by ice and stalked by enemies, Allied seamen proved that no obstacle is insurmountable when free peoples stand together against tyranny. That lesson remains as relevant today as it was 8 decades ago. The story of the Arctic Convoys continues to inspire new generations. In recent years, their courage has been recognized through memorials, medals, and remembrance ceremonies. Veterans organizations keep their memory alive, and historians continue to uncover new details of their remarkable journey. Though the generation that sailed those convoys grows smaller each year, their achievement ensures that they will never be forgotten.